I think it is fair to say that over the past 15 years, much of the focus, to some extent of the research, but also for those who were providing policy recommendations and those who were implementing reforms, was to try to reduce what we economists call the structural rate of unemployment. So the underlying level of unemployment, and try to promote an increase in the level of employment, the employment rate, so the number of people of working age who are employed. We have been in many countries in a period that in some countries called the Great Moderation. Of course, there were business cycles, there were ups and downs, but compared to what we have seen in the 70s and 80s and even the early part of the 90s, the fluctuation, the business cycle fluctuation were somewhat less strong than what happened in the past, and much more the focus was on good labor market policy institution to reduce unemployment durably and to improve the employment, so to bring more people, more disadvantaged groups into the labor market. Then we move into 2007, 8, 9, a major, what is called the Great Recession hit most countries around the world. And I think the question then is, are the same policy institutions that to some extent are conducive to better labor market outcome in terms of unemployment, employment, and access to jobs for disadvantaged group, are the same institutional policy setting, the good one also to help the labor market cope with a major shock, a major collapse in demand, increase in unemployment, and potentially, as we have seen in many countries, not only a major shock, but also a persistent shock. Because as you know, there are huge differences across the board, but not only the shock was violent in many countries in terms of GDP decline, but the recovery has been very weak in many countries. And you will see, in particular in those countries that were more hard hit by the shock in the first place. So what I'd like to do is to address 3 points. What is the evidence? And here I have to be selective, and maybe you won't mind if I refer to some of the work we have done at the OECD. There is a huge amount of empirical work there to try to shed some light on what are some of the key elements of the policy institutional setting that seems to be related with better labor market outcomes. Second, I would like to look at that from the perspective of a major shock, like the one we have seen in 2008 and 2009, and then draw some provide you with some evidence about some of the measures, some of the adjustment that was put in place during the crisis, and conclude by summarizing very briefly some of the structural reforms that maybe not by chance some countries have already put in place. As you will see, these are basically the countries that are under program. As you know, there is the Troika. This country could not longer or had significant difference accessing financing on the market. Now they are into programs, and in these programs there is also a component, sometimes a significant component, requiring this country to undertake structural reforms in the labor market. And I will shed some light of what kind of reforms this country have put in place. Again, very difficult to summarize in a few slides, but I think 2 of the main elements of the reforms, the policy reforms we have seen in a number of OECD countries over the past 15 years, were one, to try to strike a better balance between the safety net and the benefit dependency. At the OECD, we use a jargon, a word that is called the activation. In other words, try to combine better income support for unemployed and other people outside the labor market with incentives for them, those who have work capacity, to go back into the labor market. And combining that not only with the incentive for reporting on job search, but also providing them with a battery of re-employment services tailored to their needs. So this activation strategy, I would argue, was put in place back in the 90s at the time when a number of countries, the structural level of unemployment was still fairly high. But some of the evidence, and I would argue that the evidence is positive, of the effectiveness of this combination of passive, so income support plus re-employment services, has worked fairly well in a number of countries, including the Netherlands, at the time, basically in the 2000s, when there was a significant process of economic growth, when there was a buoyant labor market, when there were a number of jobs being created, and therefore this idea of activating benefit recipient back into employment made a lot of sense because there were job opportunities at the end of the road. The other, and there I think, again, the evidence is much more mixed. There has been an attempt to respond to a strong demand coming from the business community to improve, increase the flexibility of the labor market. to allow the companies to adapt more quickly to a market that was becoming more dynamic, that required more adjustment because of changes in market, because of changes in technologies, because of competition from some of the key emerging economies. To some extent, especially in Europe, this was achieved, I would argue, largely by relaxing regulation on fixed-term temporary contracts. I was in Italy last Monday to discuss with the technocratic government about their structural reform. I discovered that in Italy there are 40 different types of labor contract, fixed-term labor contract. There is one open-ended contract and 40 typologies of fixed-term, precarious, atypical, whatever you want to call it, project, consultant, and any sort. So there's been a proliferation of these type of contracts, which potentially has increased the flexibility in the labor market. I would argue has not been the kind of flexibility we were hoping, because much of these contracts do not really involve training on the job, progress for the people involved, and therefore I don't think it's a very good way to promote also this needed reallocation of labor from less to more productive jobs. The other, which is a bit more positive, is that we have seen reforms to improve the internal flexibility of firms by allowing companies to adapt the working time, not only offering part-time contract, but also varying working time depending on the fluctuation of demand. And there has been also changes, sometimes we didn't really document that appropriately, I would say, in collective bargaining, in the way in which, of course, employers and worker representative coordinate, discuss. Of course, the Netherlands is the country of wage bargaining since the early 80s, but I think we have seen that taking place in different countries. In a number of countries, there's been a dual system whereby minimum wage increases are set at the national level, and gradually more role is given to sectoral, if not, I would argue, firm level bargaining. Now, here I just select a number of those policy areas that are often used by economists to somewhat characterize labor market policy interventions. You have the EPL, which is an acronym for Employment Protection Legislation. It's a summary of those regulation legislation that affect the hiring and firing of workers. You have the collective bargaining coverage. You have the tax wedge, so the tax wedge on labor use, the unemployment benefit gross and net replacement rate, the degree of coordination between unions and employers at different levels, and then you see the employment protection again for temporary and for regular workers. The first message that I think I want you to retain from this, a huge variety. These are the changes over time. You see that especially on employment protection legislation for temporary workers, you see countries with a positive, so they have made the regulation more strict, and others that actually have deregulated the regulation for temporary contracts. The same applied across the board, all different policy areas, but you see that in some areas the heterogeneity of policy changes has been greater than others. So it's very difficult to tell a story about what really happened. There has been a huge heterogeneity of approaches, not least because the starting point was very different across the board. Now, here there is a huge literature. I cannot summarize that, I will not even try, but I actually use one of the latest reports we have done at the OECD, in which we have tried to make sense of these policy changes by relating them across countries over time for a large set of OECD countries. You can say, well, this is not exactly my finding, I got somewhat different results. To some extent, what I put here is something which is not consensus, but where there seems to be some agreement among the different empirical papers about the potential effect of these policy changes on unemployment. And what you see that, to some extent, this is not new when you take into account more sort of wage bargaining that takes place at the national level may be associated with an increase in unemployment. The unemployment replacement rate per se could actually discourage or reduce or slow down the pace of job search for the unemployed, so could be associated with a slight increase in unemployment. The wage coordination is an important factor to possibly reduce the structural level of unemployment. And the other important point I want to say is that despite the effort made to deregulate, liberalize temporary contracts, actually this has not been associated with any improvement in the labor market. If anything, you might have more people churning from one job into another one, and most of them actually spend some time into unemployment. So this way to deregulate the labor market at the margin does not seem to be associated with any significant improvement in the labor market per se. The tax wedge is another factor that could have played a role. By raising the labor cost, this might reduce the level of unemployment. Well, do this sort of empirical analysis tell you anything about what happened? Here in this chart, you have two variables. On the one end, what this simple analysis will tell you about the expected changes in the level of unemployment given the change in policy, and on the vertical axis, you have the actual change we have observed. Now, the first message is that at least the correlation is positive, so the two things went to some extent together. But I would say the good news is that actually, compared to what the model would have predicted, we have seen much larger reduction in unemployment. This is from the period from 1995 and 2007. Not all of this reduction in unemployment actually is a reduction in structural unemployment. Part of it was part of the cycle. We are looking at the 95, a period of recovery with a very strong, the end of a strong recovery period from the recession of the early 2000s. So there were other things that the model could not possibly capture that eventually led to a much bigger improvement in terms of reduction in unemployment than what you would have expected by just looking at the policy variable. Other things have changed that actually play a positive role in the labor market. Then the crisis hit. So that was history to some extent. It's 2007. Let me just give you one short anecdote. In the Employment Outlook, which is our flagship publication of the OECD that we published in 2008, we had an editorial in which we said, well, actually, there are huge differences across the board, but the OECD has reached the lowest level of unemployment in the post-war period, 5.6%. And what perhaps is even more important, the OECD area as a whole has reached the highest level of employment rate, so the employment to working age population rate we have ever seen in our data. So this period of economic recovery, some of the reforms taking place in the labor market elsewhere have led to some significant improvement in the labor market outcomes along these two dimensions of employment and unemployment. There is much more that I will try to say later on. So this is the situation in 2007. You see difference across the board, but the differences are not huge. Then the crisis hit. This is how unemployment evolved from 2007 to the peak in the unemployment that we observe in the data up to now. So see the huge difference across, this of course is only a sample of countries, but see how different was the response in the labor market in terms of unemployment. In a country like Spain, the unemployment is now above 20, is reaching 25%. In Greece, unfortunately, is above 20%. And then you have countries on the left-hand side of this chart that not only had a lower level of unemployment before the crisis, including the Netherlands, but where unemployment actually has increased very little. Certainly much less than what we would have expected if we were just using our traditional models, and you will see in a second, in which we look at the response of unemployment to a collapse in output. Perhaps what is even more worrisome in my view is this little tirade that you have. This is where we are now. And I think the bad, if you like, the very worrisome message of this chart is that in most countries, but in particular in those countries where the unemployment has increased the most, we are at the peak. In theory, these countries are in a recovery since 2010, sometimes early 2011. But we know very well that this recovery has been very weak, and we know that unfortunately a number of European countries have moved back into recession, which are not good news for the labor market. The unemployment rate is still increasing in countries like Spain, in Greece, in Portugal, in Ireland, in Italy, in France, in most of the countries in Europe where unemployment has increased significantly. On the other hand, you have countries where unemployment has increased a lot. One example, the United States, but where despite a very weak recovery and some much weaker decline in unemployment is on a downward trend. It's still very high, extremely high, but still is somewhat declining because job creation has resumed. Not to the extent we were hoping, we were expecting, given the output recovery, but still it is recovery. And then there is Germany, the outlier among the OECD countries, where actually unemployment declined. Not only in the recovery, which was stronger than in other European countries, but throughout the crisis. In Germany, the unemployment rate declined even if you exclude 2009 from 2010 on. So something else was happening over there. Two things. One is depicted in this chart, another one I will just say to you. And I think my colleagues will actually explore this issue in much more detail than I can do. Not surprisingly, but with some interesting novelties, the crisis hit certain groups much more than others, much more than others. Here you have the decline in hours and employment for different groups, social demographic groups. Again, look at the youth on average for the OECD countries. There was a huge collapse in employment and some decline in hours worked. Compare that with the prime age, and in particular with the older worker. The novelty of this chart and what is happening is that for the first time we have seen actually older workers doing relatively better than other groups, especially in terms of employment. Look at the low skill compared to the high skill, and look at the temporary employment compared to the permanent workers. This crisis, even in countries where job losses were very large, was largely covered by temporary workers. Basically, they were the ones that suffered the most, at least at the beginning, the job losses. It was easy enough for companies not to renew a temporary contract. It was much more costly to dismiss a worker on an open-ended contract because severance payment and other procedure would have kicked in quite costly in time. Look at the recovery phase. And as I said, this is a weak recovery, so the terms here have to be used carefully. But you can see that no improvement on the youth employment side. There's been a further deterioration in the youth employment compared to actually a significant increase among older workers. Look at low versus high skilled. The good news is that at least some of the companies that were doing fine have regained some employment, but of course they shift from more open-ended, more permanent into temporary employment. So the job creation has been job creation in short-term temporary employment. The other dimension, which is not here, but you have some hint of that, more than in the past, the best example is Germany, but also Italy, Belgium, and so on, a much stronger reaction in the labor market has been by reduction in working time, at least in the recessionary period, more than dismissing workers. So one lesson we are learning is that a lot was actually negotiated at the firm level between workers, representatives, and employers. But some of the programs, short-time working schemes, if they were in place for a long time and they were scaled up with more resources, may have played a role to helping firms reducing the pace of job losses and maybe reducing working time instead. You had applied this kind of thing in the construction sector in Spain, it would not have worked. So let's be clear. It depends very much on the nature of the shock. In Spain, the same kind of scheme that was used, the Kurzarbeit, in Germany would not have produced the same results, by no means, given the nature of the sector and the nature of the shock. Now, let me move from policies that could potentially be associated with better labor market outcome from a structural perspective to the resilience. In our work, and we have a chapter of the employment outlook, we look at resilience along different dimensions. Here it's just the unemployment. And the question is, are the policies that are conducive to good labor market outcomes also good for resilience, for reducing the elasticity, the responsiveness of unemployment to a GDP shock? That's the question. And here you see the differences. Just to help you, on the right-hand side, I say low and high resilience. Resilience means that for the same shock in GDP, you have a lower increase in unemployment. And you see the huge difference across the board. Some countries, not least those that indeed had a much lower level of unemployment, managed to contain the increase in unemployment due to the GDP shock. Other countries, you see, actually have much weaker ability from the labor market policy and institutions to cope with the shock. And this is based on historical data. So we're not looking at what happened during this crisis. We're just drawing from 20 years. Let's see how different labor markets cope with the shocks and the role of policy and institutions. What are the policies that could potentially help the labor market cope with the shock better? Again, from empirical work, you see that wage coordination actually play a major role. A better coordination of wage decisions at the firm level, at the sector level, actually play a significant role. On the negative side, you see again that if you have a high share of temporary precarious employment, this certainly is not conducive to reduce the pace of adjustment in terms of unemployment. As I said before, it's easy enough for many employers to simply not renew temporary contracts, so this increases the responsiveness of unemployment to shocks. So if we bring the two together, and we look at how countries fare along two dimensions. On the one hand, the ability to reduce structural unemployment. On the other hand, to increase the resilience in the labor market. So if you go, if you like, from right to left and from top to bottom, you get into countries that in one way or another manage to get better outcomes, not only in terms of low level of unemployment in normal times, the equilibrium, but also more resilience, so less responsiveness of unemployment to shocks. You see the Netherlands among the other countries. On the top, you see Spain, which unfortunately managed to reduce unemployment not as much as other countries. And on the other end, is a country where the ability of the institutional setting to help the labor market cope with a shock was much worse than many other countries. So bottom line, good news is that a number of the policies that you could argue are conducive to better labor market outcomes in terms of structural employment and unemployment are also good for increasing the resilience, the ability of the labor market to cope with shocks. Among the different set, there are two that stands out pretty clearly. One is the coordination of wage bargaining, and there's a lot to be learned, I think, from the experience of countries on that. On the negative side, this idea of allowing greater flexibility in the labor market by promoting a typical type of labor contracts. Now, does it make any sense, all of that? Again, I think you have to put these things into a reality check. So, as I said, all the analysis was based on the 20 years prior to the crisis. Here we're actually comparing what this analysis would have predicted with what really happened. And I think what you have is that the actual change has been, in many countries, smaller than what the model would have predicted. So again, there were other things that we could not take into this analysis that help the labor market coping better, so reducing the incidence or the impact of the shock onto unemployment. But there are countries, and Spain is exactly in the opposite direction, where actually the model would have predicted a much lower unemployment rate than what we have seen. There were things that work in the opposite direction. And one of the reasons is also the boom in the housing market, the significant increase in employment in the construction sector, much of which actually is gone with the crisis. Let me say a few words now on what happened during the crisis. I think we sent a questionnaire to all member countries of the OECD, asking them, what are you doing? We gave them a very detailed questionnaire. The good news there was that we have seen a lot of action. I mean, some of these were maybe small measures, others were bigger measures, but many countries have tried to do something. They used resources that were available in the stimulus packages to scale up different types of programs. In particular, there were two that stands out. More resources than in the past were made available for the re-employment services, scaling up resources for public employment services, having more money for training, and so on and so forth. And the other, the short-time working schemes. Scaling up or introducing, like in the Netherlands, short-time working schemes to provide subsidy to companies that were planning to reduce working time instead of dismissing workers. Just a picture to show you where we were before the crisis, what happened during the crisis. It's a bit complicated, let me help you on that one. You have the share of GDP spent on passive, so income support for the unemployed, and active, everything that goes into re-employment service of different type. In different countries, just pick up a number of countries, and I also put, to make things a little bit more complicated, the unemployment rate before the crisis and during the crisis. One of the messages that emerged from this chart is that there is a very weak correlation between the amount of resources that were available before the crisis for labor market policies and the level of unemployment. Your country, other countries, spend much more as a share of GDP for labor market policies than other countries that had, before the crisis, a much higher level of unemployment. So obviously there's also a social preference for having a more well-established, more well-equipped labor market programs. What happened during the crisis? Spending on income support for the unemployed went up almost everywhere. This is not a surprise. It's an entitlement, so people lost their job. Many of them had access to unemployment benefit. The most discretionary part of the story, so what you put on the table for active labor market policy, there you see some increases, but pretty small, right? So remember what I said at the beginning? A good setting on labor market policy is a good combination of income support and re-employment services. If you work on one side but not on the other, you might not necessarily achieve the same kind of results. And the increase, beyond the increase for spending on labor market for income support for the unemployed, is also uncorrelated with the increase in unemployment. So some countries increase the resources for active policy more, despite the fact that their unemployment rate did not really increase as much as in other countries. Okay? Look, for example, at Spain. There was a tiny increase in resources for active labor market policy at a time when unemployment, as I told you, doubled, if not beyond that. So massive increase in unemployment. So there are good news and bad news here. Compared with the past, and again, across the board, remind the huge difference across countries, we have seen a stronger response in terms of increase in spending for active labor market policies than what we've seen in the past. If I were, at the time, I show you the the evolution over time from a longer period of time, you see that active labor market policy spending is pretty flat over the business cycle, so very little increase. More structural changes related to change in policy setting rather than responses to crisis. So you see the actual increase compared with what we would have predicted using previous, the history, what happened in the past, much stronger response. But look what happened if you look at the right-hand side. If you look at the resources available per unemployed, you see a significant decline. Much less than what we would have predicted looking at the history, minus 30% predicted, but still more than minus 20%. So at a time when you need more resources for helping the unemployment in difficult time, when jobs are limited and so on, actually went down, and this again is the average, by 20%. So public employment services, public authorities had fewer resources to deal with per unemployed at a time when the situation was arguably much more difficult. This is slightly controversial, but I just wanted to put it on the table. 22 of the 29 OECD countries that responded to our questionnaire said yes, we have scaled up resources for short-time working schemes. For those countries that already had the scheme, Kurzarbeit, Cassa Integrazione, the Belgian system, and so on. Others, including yours, said, well, we didn't really have a short-time working scheme in place. We pilot one, and then we put in place another one. And this is what happened in terms of individuals that were involved into these short-time working schemes. We economists are very concerned about this kind of programs because we know that there is what we call a deadweight cost. Maybe some companies are taking advantage of the scheme, but they would have reduced working time anyhow, right? So how do you distinguish, how you make sure that what you're looking at is not just the gross number of people involved, but what would have happened with and without the scheme. So how many jobs you could possibly argue you really have saved compared to a situation in which the scheme was not in place. This is hard science, it's very difficult. What we have done, we have again looked at countries that did not have the scheme and countries that had the scheme, firms that could not benefit in the past compared to firms that could benefit during these extended schemes, and so try to identify the possible effect. The good news here is that there is some net effect, which in some countries is sizable. It's not as large as the total number of those involved, but it's a good news compared to what we know from the evaluation of programs in the past. But of course, these are very costly programs. And the other message that this chart shows you, which I think is very important, this may work in the short term. In Germany, GDP declined more than in many other European and countries like the US. Many companies use the Kurzarbeit. Actually, they use other bilateral agreements at a firm level to reduce working time. But as of the mid of 2009, they start cutting down on the short-time working scheme, on the use of the Kurzarbeit, and they start increasing working time again. So it was really a short-term measure to help companies coping with what was a tremendous, a very large short-term shock, and where many of them, at least the medium and small-size enterprise, have huge difficulty in accessing credit. Where they were confronted with the dilemma of dismissing some of the workers, they had difficulties in recruiting in the previous period. There was a labor shortage and a skill shortage in Germany, as you know. Look at what happened in Italy. Huge increase, but if you look at 2010, still increasing. So to some extent, the level will remain high. So then the short-time working scheme is playing a somewhat different role. There, it's a form of income support for those who are still involved into the restructuring of the company, many of whom will never be able to go back into full employment. So then this kind of scheme is playing a completely different role. It's subsidizing company well into the recovery, and there, the risk that these kind of schemes have high deadweight costs tend to increase. So again, common response, different size of the intervention, possible positive effect in the short run, if protracted, risk that this actually turn into subsidizing company across the board without being able really to target and use appropriately public funds. I have a few minutes, but I want just to walk you through quickly some of the reforms that have taken place. These are not by chance. 3 out of the 4 are the countries under a program, IMF, the European Commission, and the OECD. Italy is not a program country, of course, but of course was under huge market pressure to make reforms across the board. The concern that motivates some of these reforms the labor market, very significant difference in type, quality of jobs, pay, and so on and so forth. And as I said, strong pressure from the international financial market. Much of what happened actually was reforming the legislation on employment protection, the hiring, and in particular the firing of unemployed. What are some of the common features of these reforms? There was a reduction in upfront severance costs in some countries, and the compensation for unfair dismissals. Has to be said, these countries tend to have very generous severance payment and compensations. An expansion of what is a fair dismissal compared to what is an unfair dismissal. An attempt to extend the trial period to try to create a stronger incentive for employers to hire on a permanent basis, but allow them to test to see whether the match between the job and the worker is actually a good one. There has been also some attempt, completely different ways, on trying to reduce the imbalances between the potential cost of temporary versus permanent contract. In some countries, this has been achieved by reducing the regulation of temporary contracts, while in other countries has been by making temporary contracts more costly, and therefore pushing employers more into open-ended permanent contract. Two important issues from a political economy of reforms. Most of these changes will not affect the current employed population. There is no grandfathering. So it means that they will apply only for the new contracts. This was a reason. I mean, you don't want to create a stronger incentive for firms to dismiss in countries where unemployment is very high, but also implies that the economic effect of this reform will only materialize over time, especially when you look at the dismissal cost. On the regulation for temporary contracts, so on the hiring side, the effect could actually be more short-term. And in two countries, in Italy and Spain, much of this reform will depend on how the labor judges will interpret the new law and how they would react to that. And we know very well from jurisprudence that judges are extremely sensitive to the conditions in the labor market and how their decision could affect not only the individual condition of the individual concerned and their household, their family, but also the overall labor market condition in the area where they operate. So again, I don't have time to get into the details. This is some of the key elements of the regulatory system, and this is how the different countries have reformed the legislation. There is some, there are some attempts along a number of dimensions, but there's also quite a significant variety across the board. Let me conclude with a few final remarks, and I very much look forward for the discussion that will follow this presentation. I think there were a number of good steps that have taken place in a number of OECD countries, a huge heterogeneity across the board. In particular, in my view, in reforming labor market policy in a way that takes this mutual obligation principle, whereby if you receive a support from the state, you have to do whatever you can, and if you have work capacity, to go back into employment. Employment first, or job first kind of approach. This worked more or less okay in a number of countries in the good times. The big challenge and question we are facing is that how this job first approach can work in bad times, when jobs at the end of the process are fewer, and when there is a lot of competition among the employers for the few vacancies that which are available in the labor market. The other good news is that a broad range of policies that are good for improving underlying labor market conditions are also good for improving the resiliency of the labor market, but there are some that potentially were not fully reviewed or analyzed, including collective bargaining and coordination of wage bargaining, which I think have played a significant role during the crisis. And I think there is a lot more to be done. In concrete terms, I hate to use this flexicurity term because it's much abused, but I think in order to improve the support to the unemployed and others affected by shocks, with all the kind of services which are needed in the labor market to promote their reintegration. I think a lot of mistakes have been done, in particular in Europe, in creating what I call the bad flexibility. A lot should be done in order to try to move into a better flexibility, and also, and I conclude with that, a flexibility which is not born only on some part of the workforce. Our young people, women, the low skills, immigrants, depending on the countries. I didn't have time to say that, but one warning element that characterizes all of that is that in 3/4 of the OECD countries, we have seen a significant increase in income inequality, and much of that is also related to increase in wage inequality. So yes, some outcomes in terms of employment and unemployment before the crisis were much better, but we have seen a widening of conditions in the labor market and things which could be related to job quality, including the pay. Thank you very much for your attention. It's been a pleasure.